March 17, 2026. Noginsk, a quiet suburban town about 60 kilometers from the capital. Morning. An ordinary residential building, an ordinary stairwell, one of thousands just like it in the Moscow suburbs. The landlady of one of the apartments heads upstairs. A routine visit to check on the tenants who moved in the night before. She rents the place out by the day. This is routine. She'd done dozens of visits like this. She takes out the key and presses the door handle and freezes on the threshold. What she sees doesn't register right away. A few seconds of complete silence. And then she screams, truly screams, at full volume, loud enough to be heard through the walls. Neighbors peer into the hallway. By that point, she's already dialing ambulance, police, or everything at once in a single call. Just the address. Just get here. Inside the apartment, 2 people, both alive. But what exactly she found in there, I'll say later. Not for the sake of suspense, but for the sake of understanding. Because this scene is the final point of a story that had been unfolding long before March 17th. And if you start from the end, you'll see an image you won't understand. And this story demands understanding. It's about how a person breaks apart from the inside, quietly, invisibly, while no one is watching. The morning of that same March 17th, but not in Noginsk. In Moscow, a man, 48 years old, wakes up and discovers something that shouldn't be. His wife didn't come home last night. The apartment is empty. On the table, a note. He picks it up and reads it. We don't know how long he held it in his hands. Maybe he reread it several times. Maybe he understood immediately. But the next action is unambiguous. He calls Liza alert. That's an important detail we'll return to later. His wife, Elizaveta, 49 years old, is missing. Along with her, their son Daniil, 12 years old. Where they are is unknown. When they left, apparently the evening or night before. What was written in the note the investigation will establish. The family knows. We won't recount the contents. We'll only say one thing. After reading it, the husband didn't waste time on doubt. He knew this wasn't a quarrel, not an impulse, not an escape from exhaustion. It was written by a person who had made a decision. What kind of decision would become clear later? For now, just the fact. The family is incomplete. The husband is alone in the apartment, and somewhere in the Moscow suburbs, a woman with her son. This family, from the outside, looked completely ordinary. The husband, an entrepreneur, 48, Moscow. Electronics and household goods trade, a small but stable business, not wealth, but comfort. An apartment, the ability to live without dire need. She was 49, took care of the home, took care of the children. That's how it goes in families where one earns and the other holds down the fort, established roles, familiar on the surface, one of a million such families. No records, no reports to Child Protective Services or social agencies, no complaints from neighbors about noise or anything else. The ordinary people who lived nearby apparently knew them only by sight. A hello in the stairwell and move on. Life in apartment buildings works exactly this way. You can go years without knowing what happens behind the neighbor's door. And this particular family lived quietly, with no outward signs of trouble, none of the stories that neighbors tell journalists, none of the signals that might alarm outsiders. A calm family, seemingly well off, at least from the outside. So let's reconstruct the events of March 16th, 2026, as far as the known facts allow. She put shoes on him, then got dressed herself. A puffer jacket and jeans, ordinary clothing for a cold March evening. From the outside, it would have looked like ordinary preparations. A mother and son heading somewhere. But this wasn't a walk. On the table, the note for her husband was already waiting. Whether she wrote it before getting ready or after, we'll never know. They left the apartment, got on transport, heading toward Noginsk, along the Gorky line. Why that particular town? The family apparently had no obvious connection to it. No relatives, no acquaintances, no old addresses. A simple town, far enough from Moscow not to be recognized by chance, close enough to reach that same night. And in these preparations, no panic, no chaos, only the calm of a person who had already made up her mind about everything. In Noginsk, Elizaveta rented an apartment by the day. This was not a sudden impulse. She had found the listing in advance, arranged it, paid for it. Standard procedure. Keys, terms, no unnecessary questions. The landlady didn't suspect anything unusual. A mother and son arriving to spend the night. Ordinary clients. They went inside, the door closed. Now about what had been happening with Elizaveta in the year before that evening. People who knew her said she had changed. From the inside, without showing it on the outside. Before, an ordinary woman, a mother, a wife. Then something else. Withdrawn, detached, as if she had retreated into herself and never come back. Acquaintances noticed she was communicating less, going out less, speaking less. What exactly happened a year ago? We won't say yet. It's an important detail, and it will require a separate conversation. For now, the fact. The woman who rented that apartment was not the same person people had known a few years earlier. Whatever had been happening inside her is ultimately what brought her to a stranger's apartment in a stranger's town, with her son behind a closed door. Let's try to piece together a picture of Elizaveta before and after. Before, a woman who had built her life around her family, home, children, husband, everything familiar, everything in its place. She didn't work outside the home, not because she couldn't, but because that's how things had developed. The husband earned, she handled the household. That was her world. After, the same apartment, the same walls, but something had fundamentally shifted. The husband during this period apparently threw himself into work, more hours at the office, more time away from home. Not out of indifference. Most likely it was his own reaction to something heavy that was happening in the family. Men often cope exactly this way. Work as a way not to think, not to feel, to keep functioning. At home, silence. Not a peaceful silence, but an empty one. Two people under one roof, each with their own burden. Neighbors didn't hear arguments. Acquaintances didn't talk about conflicts. The theory of a family breakdown in the usual sense, arguments, threats, pressure, it didn't hold together. This was something different. Not aggression, but something quiet and far heavier than shouting through the walls. But it was already clear. The silence in that home was not a sign of peace, but of something unbearable. The husband raises the alarm on March 17th. He calls Liza Alert, a volunteer search organization that handles missing persons. The team published an alert with the woman's public name, Pavlova, 49 years old. That was how she appeared in public records. A photograph, a description, her appearance. Last known location. The alert spread across the internet. Many saw it in the first hours after publication. Here's what matters. The husband raised the alarm himself, immediately. He didn't wait. Didn't try to sort it out alone. He called search and rescue. That action in itself says something about the situation. When something related to domestic pressure or threats happens in a family, the person responsible behaves differently. The guilty party doesn't call search teams, doesn't put out alerts, doesn't draw attention to themselves. The husband did the exact opposite, so that his wife would be found as quickly as possible. The theory that she was running from him falls apart on its own. She didn't leave because of him. She left for a different reason, and he most likely knew that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have read that note with that expression on his face. What happened the night of March 16th to 17th? We only know what the investigation established. They arrived in Noginsk, entered the apartment. Daniil was most likely tired from the journey, in an unfamiliar place. But his mom was next to him, which meant he could close his eyes and fall asleep. For a 12-year-old with developmental differences, his mother is his entire world. Safety, protection. As long as she's beside him, everything is okay. He slept. What exactly took place during those nighttime hours in the apartment, the investigation established conclusively. The wounds that were found on him were inflicted by his mother. The weapon was a sharp object. The area, the chest. Investigators from the Investigative Committee for the Moscow region processed the scene. Forensic specialists documented everything necessary. There is no ambiguity about who carried out these actions. We won't say more about the details of that night. They wouldn't add understanding, only pain. What matters is something else. This was not a sudden outburst, not an accident. This was a premeditated act, part of that very decision that began with a carefully folded note. After what she did, Elizaveta inflicted harm on herself as well. The details are in the case files. We won't disclose them. What matters is this: she intended to leave that same night. This is not speculation, it's a conclusion drawn from the sequence of actions. The note she left was a farewell. Leave for another city, rent a stranger's apartment, do what she did, and depart. That was the design of this plan. But the plan didn't work. She lost consciousness. Evidence was found in the bathroom. When the landlady opened the door the next morning, Elizaveta was unconscious but alive, and the paramedics arrived in time. Both were taken to intensive care. She survived. People who had known her in the last year said later, she lived as if in a fog. She moved, answered questions, performed familiar tasks, but it was as though she wasn't there inside. Why she ended up in that fog, we won't explain yet. We're simply noting it. She spent the last year essentially fading from within, slowly, and in complete isolation. Shortly before leaving, or perhaps already from Noginsk, the exact time hasn't been established in public sources, Elizaveta sent her husband a text message, a brief message whose contents are also largely unknown. But the fact itself matters. It wasn't, "Help me," it wasn't, quote, "one," it wasn't a cry for help. From everything that can be reconstructed from context, it was a farewell, a final, full stop. She wasn't asking to be brought back. She wasn't calling for help. She was informing him. It's over. This small detail changes a great deal in understanding what happened. When a person snaps, it looks different. A breakdown is chaotic, inconsistent, impulsive. But here, nothing of the sort. A note on the table, a text to her husband, a carefully dressed son, and a trip to Noginsk, and a rented apartment. All of these are elements of a plan that wasn't built in a single evening. This decision had been forming for a long time, and by the moment she pressed send on her phone, it had already been made. Only one final step remained. There is a difference between a person reaching out and a person saying goodbye. These are fundamentally different things. When something like this happens in a family, the first theory investigators check is money, debts, business, financial collapse. The husband is an entrepreneur, trade, electronics. Public records mention a sole proprietorship and former LLCs. You'd think maybe the business collapsed, maybe debts they couldn't pay. It's a plausible scenario. It would be understandable. A person in a financial hole sometimes does irreversible things, but this theory doesn't hold up. First argument against it: the apartment in Noginsk was rented without difficulty. There was money for it. Not the last pennies, not borrowed. Simply money that's there when it's there. Second argument: the husband's behavior. He raised the alarm immediately and publicly. A person with something to hide doesn't act that way. He retreats into the shadows. The financial theory falls apart. But then why did the husband work so much? Why did he throw himself into business so intensely during this particular period? Not out of ambition, out of something else, something personal, something he apparently wasn't ready to talk about, and we're already beginning to understand what it was. What was written in it was never disclosed publicly. The investigation studied it, the family knows the contents. The public does not, and we won't speculate about the exact words. But certain things can be reconstructed from the context of the entire story. It wasn't an ultimatum. There were no accusations, no threats, no demands, no screaming on paper. In all likelihood, it was something closer to an explanation. An attempt to say, "I'm leaving and here's why," or "I can no longer go on," or "I've thought about this for a long time." Notes like this aren't written in 5 minutes in a burst of emotion. They're written when the decision is made, and all that remains is to try to explain. It's time to talk about the situation in more detail. Daniil, 12 years old, has developmental differences. This means a special rhythm of life, a special daily routine, special needs, a special degree of dependence on the adult beside him. Children like this often can't do many of the things their peers can. Managing daily tasks independently, handling changes, dealing with unexpected situations. They need a specific person, reliable, familiar, someone they can trust without question. For Daniil, that person was his mother. She knew him better than anyone else in the family, his rhythms, his reactions, his way of communicating what he needed. She built her life around him, and that is the single most important key to understanding this entire story. According to the investigation and family members, Elizaveta was afraid of leaving him behind, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved him too much and didn't believe anyone without her could care for him the way he needed. This fear is well known to parents of children with special needs. If something happens to me, usually it lives somewhere in the background. For Elizaveta, at some point, it became everything. So, up until now, we've been talking about a family of 3. The husband, Elizaveta, Daniil. But that wasn't the full picture, because this family didn't have 2 children. They had 3. The eldest, Timur, 20 years old, a young man, nearly grown, an older brother. We pause here deliberately because the next single sentence changes everything you've thought about this story up to now. This family had already endured a loss. Timur passed away. When exactly and under what circumstances, we'll tell you later. For now, just this: 3 children, 1 gone. And after that, something in Elizaveta broke for good, and by all accounts, with no possibility of going back. All the previous details, the withdrawal, the fog, the changed woman, the husband retreating into work, the empty silence at home, they no longer look coincidental. They form a single line. This family was grieving, quiet, closed off, invisible from the outside, the kind of grief you don't share with neighbors, the kind you face alone behind a closed door. It was precisely this grief that became the starting point for everything that followed. Brain cancer. Timur passed away in 2025, an oncological illness that, according to available information, had been developing for about a year. That means the family spent roughly 12 months in survival mode. Tests, treatment, hope, despair. A year like that leaves no one untouched, because she, as a rule, takes on everything. Organizing the treatment, the trips, the late-night calls to doctors, explaining to the second son, maintaining the appearance of normalcy in the home. It changes you physically. It devastates the mind. And then Timur was gone. After that, Elizaveta fell into depression, not sadness, not prolonged grief. Depression, a condition in which a person stops being able to cope. Now all the previous details fall into place. The withdrawal is a symptom. The detachment. The woman her acquaintances no longer recognized is a person in depression after losing a son. Beside her, a second son who depends on her entirely, and a husband who was coping differently. And no one noticed she was standing on the very edge. Depression after loss is one of the most severe states a human being can experience. It's not simply grief, it's pain that barely moves forward. The person exists, but doesn't live. And Elizaveta existed. She kept up the household, took care of Daniil, answered questions, but inside, an emptiness no one could see. The husband during this period was coping differently. Work became his way of not falling apart completely. Retreat into action, into tasks, into being busy. That too is a response to grief, just a different one. Neither better nor worse. 2 people under one roof, grieving separately, each in their own way. This disconnect, by all accounts, only deepened her isolation. When you're suffering and you're alone, it only gets worse. Or they noticed but didn't understand the severity, or they understood but didn't know how to talk about it. That's how it goes in families accustomed to handling things on their own. No specialist, no conversation that reaches the very bottom, just silence. And in this case, time was working against them. According to the investigation and family members, the picture looked like this. Elizaveta made the decision to end her own life, and it was forming within a state of depression, that is, a state in which the perception of reality is distorted. When depression reaches that point, a person can no longer see other ways out. The world narrows to a single thought: I can't do this anymore. But she couldn't simply leave. There was Daniil, 12 years old, dependent on her, attached to her with his entire being. Here is the most terrifying and the most humanly comprehensible thing at the same time. In the logic of despair, the logic of a mind ravaged by illness, leaving him meant abandoning him. She was convinced that without her, no one could care for him the way he needed. Not because the people around her were cruel or indifferent, she simply thought that way because only she knew him the way she did, and she made the decision to take him with her. This is not hatred, not cruelty. It is despair that took the form of care, distorted, devastating, impossible. In her mind, it was the final act of maternal love. This is precisely what the investigation and family members call the motive. And let's return to the beginning. Morning, March 17th, an ordinary residential building. The landlady heads upstairs, a routine visit to the tenants, takes out the key, opens the door. Now you know what exactly she saw in there and why she screamed. He was lying there, alive, but with wounds to the chest area, the aftermath of what happened during the night. She was on the floor, unconscious with evidence of what she had done. Evidence in the bathroom. 2 people who were supposed to be gone according to the plan. Both remained alive. By sheer chance, by a combination of circumstances, because the body sometimes continues to live despite any plan. The landlady called an ambulance and police. Paramedics arrived, then forensic investigators. The scene was processed, traces documented, the instrument, the circumstances, everything by the protocol of a serious case. Both were taken by medical personnel, and that was the conclusion, but not the final word. The final word is in what followed, in the criminal case, in the fate of the father, and in one short phrase he spoke. The investigation established that the wounds were inflicted by the mother. A criminal case was opened under a serious charge carrying imprisonment. The mother is accused of what she did to her own son that night in Noginsk. Elizaveta survived, and that means sooner or later she will face trial. What happens to her next is a question that is both medical and legal at the same time. His own words. He was the only one to give a public comment on this case. Verbatim. "We found them. They're not okay. Honestly, I don't want to talk about it." 8 words. Not an accusation, not tears for show, not hatred, just a person with nothing left to add, or too much to say out loud. This man lost both sons. Timur was taken by illness. Daniil survived, but what happened to him that night won't heal quickly, if it heals at all. This story is not about a monster and not about a victim in the usual sense. It's about how a person breaks apart invisibly without sirens, without outside help. Elizaveta lost her eldest son. She grieved it in isolation because beside her was a husband who coped differently and a younger son who needed her. Not that she needed something, she was needed. And in that, perhaps, lies the trap. When everyone needs you, there's no one to tell, quote, depression without treatment is not weakness and not a choice. It is an illness. It narrows everything, makes impossible what seems obvious from the outside. Reaching out for help, saying it out loud, calling someone. And there is yet another layer to this story, about parents of children with special needs. That fear for their child's future lives in them for years. Usually it's quiet, but when grief is added to it, it becomes unbearable. That is exactly what it became for Elizaveta. We are not justifying what she did. We are trying to understand how it comes to this, because until we understand, it will keep happening. In silence, behind closed doors. What do you think about this video? Write in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.